Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
We're most pleased to bring you a 2-week series with an author. We do many of those type of programs where someone who's written an important book and has received lots of attention, as they come to visit at our campus, we interview them. Our guest today was with us when he wrote his first book. We're so pleased to welcome to the program Dominic Polera, who is an author, a commentator, and a consultant who writes, speaks, and consults on issues related to race and gender and national origin and such backgrounds. And he's a native of the state of Wisconsin. His publications include the first book, Visible Differences, Why Race Will Matter to Americans in the 21st Century, and he was here last year to discuss that book. His new book is just out, and I'd like to show you a copy called Sharing the Dream, White Males in Multicultural America. This book came out in November 2004, and we're airing this program in early 2005. The publisher of this book is Continuum International Publishing Group, Incorporated, both in New York and in London. In this particular book, he discusses the role of white males in our society, and as we become a more diverse society, what role they play. Our guest travels around the United States and around the world to many countries speaking on his works. And Mr. Polera, it's a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you for being with us this week and again next week.
Thank you, Professor Stewart, for having me. It's very nice to be back again.
It's always great to have you on campus, and as always, we're pleased to have Erna Reinhardt, who's the Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College, as our panelist, and she will start today's questioning.
Welcome to the show, Dominic. It's a wonderful honor for us to have you on our campus and to have you back on our show. My first question is a very general question. Tell our viewers why you chose this topic and why you decided to do this particular book.
I began to think about these issues in the mid-1990s. At that time, as you may remember, there was a lot of discussion in the media about the so-called angry white males, individuals who were allegedly upset about affirmative action and related issues, and who had voted the Republicans in 1994. Also at that time, we had the rise of the militia movement, what was then described as the militia movement. And these two factors in particular led to a lot of discussion in the media about white males and their feelings about the demographic changes that are occurring in our society. I felt, just as one observer, I felt that the coverage I was seeing did not take into account the views and lives of most white males in multicultural America. To be sure, there are some individuals who hold very intolerant views, and there were some who continue to be involved in hate groups. But it was, as I was looking at the media coverage, I thought that this focus on a certain number of white males wasn't taking into account fully the experiences of the people I knew in my day-to-day life. So I started to think about white maleness as an issue and a topic, and I began to put down my thoughts, and many years later, there's that book.
The book is very comprehensive. Share with us how you went about doing the research and selecting the different stories that you have to tell in this book.
Okay. One tries in a work of this type to be as inclusive as possible. For starters, because this book is about multicultural America, I would say at least half of the people who were interviewed are not white males. And when one is writing about America, as is the case in this book, one has to take into account the opinions of everybody. So about half the people interviewed are white males, and about half are women and people of color. Most of the vignettes are about specific white males and the different things that they're doing that allow them to reach out to people or take some kinds of positions on multicultural matters. Some of these individuals are liberal, some are conservative, some of them have no discernible ideological perspective. I tried to take into account age, ethnicity, religion, and a host of other factors, including geography. There are a few examples of people who were profiled who also come from other countries because we try to learn from the experiences of individuals elsewhere too. In each case, try to look at where we are as a country and where we're going, oftentimes in the context of specific communities.
Excellent.
I want to follow up on the excellent questions that Erna Reinhardt just asked you. Let's get a few statistics. I don't want to overburden our audience with just statistics, but if you go back in the United States into the early 20th century and come forward over the past 100 years, the makeup of this country and its growth and immigration, it's a different picture today than it was 100 years ago. Give us a few statistics about, and I would include in this discussion both women and men as far as the Caucasian population and its statistical standing in the country 100 years ago from now. In other words, we've become a more diverse society. Can you give us a few statistics? And then white males and how they have declined in number during that period of time.
Okay. When we look at the demographics of our population, of course, there are roughly equal numbers of men and women, males and females. So until about, say, 20 or 25 years ago, most people in this country would have been classified as white. Say in 1970, I'd say we'd be looking at about 85% white. So if you look at roughly, half of those individuals are male and half are female, maybe 42% or so of our population in 1970 would have been made up of white males. Today, depending on how you classify people, we're looking at 33 to 35, 36% in there somewhere. I often use 35% because it's to some extent a midpoint. Now, looking toward the future, by 2050, we're going to have a country in which slightly more than half of the people would be classified as white. Of course, assuming that the present classification schemas are in place.
And so then by that time, about 25% of the total population would be white males in this country.
Exactly. And if I just may add, sometimes when we're considering these issues, many of them, and when we talk about white males in American society, many of these issues apply to white heterosexual able-bodied males because increasingly there is a recognition on the part of our policymakers that persons with disabilities experience discrimination in certain contexts, and there are policies to take that into account. And then also with sexual minorities, while there are not affirmative action programs in place for them, increasingly there are anti-discrimination statutes and so forth, particularly in certain localities and with many corporations as well.
Thank you for those statistics, because that does show us the trend that this country is more and more all the time a very diverse country. And would it be correct to say from your research that of all countries in the world, and some countries have very different demographics than others, that the United States, both as to race and national origin and all those issues, is one of the most, it's becoming one of the most diverse and representative populations in the world?
Absolutely, that's a wonderful point. The only other large multi-ethnic or slash multiracial country in the world similar to ours in terms of the just complete diversity would be Brazil. And we're larger than Brazil. Brazil is just an amazingly diverse place. We're larger than Brazil, so we have, in certain cases, more people from different communities here than you would have in Brazil. Now, there are many disparities and inequities in our society, and that should be noted. At the same time, I believe, as do many Americans, that there's no other large multi-ethnic nation or empire in the history of the world that's offered as many opportunities for as many people from as many groups, as is the case here in the United States.
And one more question before I go back to Erna Reinhardt. And you alluded to this in your answering her question. And if I'm reading your book incorrectly, of course you will correct me, but I hear you saying that when we have these debates in this country in relation to such issues as race and gender, that you felt in writing this book that maybe I read it that white males sometimes have been given an unfair stereotyping, unfair labeling. What I'm getting at is that as I read the book, I see you talking about a lot of white males who obviously have been very much part of the decision making, or the majority of decision makers in the country, in corporate America and in government. But that there are many white males who are celebrating and inviting into the decision making women and people of color in corporations. You have some examples in here of in corporate America that corporations are actually, many of them are leading the movement towards employment that's diverse, and certainly in the academic world and in government. So would you just elaborate a little bit on why it is not correct to say, according to your studies, that all white males are somewhat negative towards diversity, or bringing to the table people of different backgrounds?
We have seen tremendous progress in the last 40 to 50 years in terms of our attitudes in this country. And I speak particularly with regard to white Americans, those who have traditionally been numerically dominant and who've held most of the power. This is not to say that there isn't a lot of progress that needs to be made. That is true. But we've seen a real shift in attitudes in many cases. Now, to some extent, where you come down on this issue depends on where you stand ideologically. Many of our friends on the left would say that those individuals who are not actively involved in supporting various diversity initiatives and multicultural programs need to do some more work, some more thinking on those issues. Whereas many of our friends on the right would say that non-discrimination is enough. Create opportunities and let people take advantage of them. And then there are many folks in the middle who want to see some kind of middle ground in that they acknowledge fully that there are cases in which certain diversity initiatives and multicultural programs are essential to make sure that all of our citizens can achieve success as they define it. That said, many white male Americans, particularly in our elites, in the academy and in corporate America and in our government, are very strong rhetorical proponents of diversity. Now, when I say rhetorical proponents, I say rhetorical proponents not because I'm casting aspersions on anyone. It's just that some people, particularly people of color, some people of color I should say, and some on the left, whites and people of color alike, feel that our present efforts to facilitate inclusion aren't moving quickly enough. But that said, there's been a tremendous change in the last 20 to 30 years in terms of the efforts that people are making, white males among them, to try to bring about more opportunities. That's not to say that every white male feels this way. A number of white males, many of them in fact, are strongly for equal opportunity, but they, in their opinion, they don't see a need for a tremendous number of programs to help facilitate that opportunity. They feel that anti-discrimination laws are sufficient and that certain affirmative action programs and multicultural initiatives are not always very good. That's how many of them look at it.
Erna Reinhardt.
You are such an expert in this field, Dominic. I really want to embrace that and have you share a lot of that information with us today. There have been so many parts of our society where white males have dominated. What I want to do with this question is to have you share with us some of that good news and some of those specific examples in various different areas of society where there has been progress, such as in politics. Your story about Walter Mondale, it was a great one in your book. Maybe another example about a Fortune 500 company. There's different segments of society that really have embraced diversity. Could you share a couple of specific examples with us?
Okay, great. Yeah, it's when one looks at these issues, there's always to use a cliche, the matter of whether the glass is half full, whether it's half empty. And let's take, for example, the United States Senate, which continues to be a bastion of white males. In the last election, in November, we saw that there were two senators elected, one from Florida and one from Colorado, who are Latino. A senator was elected from Illinois who was African American, or who is African American. So that's an example of progress being made, and the representation of women in the Senate is gradually increasing. So one can look at the Senate, for example, and say things are changing there. At the same time, however, most senators are white men, and there are some Americans who feel that they'd like to see a lot more diversity in the body. Others don't care. I have a friend who's apolitical, completely apolitical, but he remarked upon what he saw as the relative homogeneity of the Senate when you watch the State of the Union address. Now, corporate America is another really interesting example. The reason being that most CEOs of Fortune 500 companies today are white men. That's the case right now. If one looks at the positions that are held by people 1 or 2 or 3 rungs below the CEO's job, we're seeing a lot more diversity. So, that said, there's a very good possibility in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years we're going to see more women and people of color in the CEO jobs at Fortune 500 companies. And the reason I cite the Fortune 500 companies is only because their CEOs tend to be most visible. So it's easier to keep track of who holds those jobs. Now, in other realms of our society, such as our popular culture, it would be highly unusual today if one were to see a mainstream, big budget movie in which virtually all of the characters were white. And there were some films, even I can think of one in the late 1990s where that was the case. And we're not seeing that very often anymore. And that's an example, of progress. It's symbolic, but when all of us, when we go into the movie theaters, it's nice to see people who look like you do on the screen. Mm-hmm. And we've also seen the embrace, in many cases, by young white youths of heroes, if you want to call them that, of color in our popular culture. Now, some of these individuals do not have much exposure to people of color in their day-to-day lives, if they live in a racially homogeneous community, for instance. But the fact that it's one step to see yourself represented in the popular culture. Advertising is another one. I say it all the time that it'd be very hard for a mainstream company that wants to be taken seriously by all of us here in the United States if the company did not make a reasonable effort to represent different faces from different groups in their advertising. One excellent example of that would be to go to the post office and just look at the faces in the various displays. The post office does a nice job with that, I think.
I'd like to follow up again on Ernest's question. And you have done a very good job of indicating both in the corporate world, in the academic world, and in government, changes are coming. And I, a few days ago, looked at some of those statistics, and there certainly is significant change, although it, as you said, you've got your more conservative philosophy, moderate philosophy, liberal philosophy, and that's fine. They're not all going to agree on exactly how best to approach the issue always. But I noticed in the latest statistics that in the new Congress, the U.S. House, mm-hmm. there will be 65 women, and there'll be 40 African Americans and mm-hmm. 20-some Latinos, mm-hmm. 14 women in the Senate, and it was only a few years ago there were no women in the Senate. So change is coming, and certainly it's back to the glass where it's half full, half empty, but certainly that's still not 50-50 ratio like in gender in either mm-hmm. house. Mm-hmm. But we also see in statistics that women are increasing their numbers in the state legislatures across the country. So we are getting at the political table or the corporate table much more diversity, which is very enriching, and more viewpoints. So based on that, I would like for you to address, that you did in your book, the issue. I'll start with corporate America, and maybe next week deal with some of the others. But one CEO that you interviewed that I know well has a very fascinating theory, and it wound up in your book. His comments to me were that if you go back to the 1940s, that a presidential executive order, and those are very significant, by President Truman integrated the military. Mm-hmm. And from that major step forward for civil rights, that people who were in the military from the South, in particular men, went back to the South and said they were much more acceptable of diversity or integration. Mm-hmm. His thesis is that now that's happening in corporate America in other mm-hmm. issues of diversity, and that even the president led that particular movement, that corporate America will be the next leader mm-hmm. in dealing with what we're talking about here. I'd like to get your reaction, not only from that particular CEO, but did you find that a common thread across the country? Were there others that believe that corporate America is going to be the leader in this issue?
Mm-hmm. Many of the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are among the most energetic and passionate proponents of diversity in our country. They have a very, very important role to play as the leaders of such large corporations, because their companies play very important roles in so many of our communities. Now, we have seen a significant rhetorical commitment on the part of many Fortune 500 company CEOs to diversity. The different companies have different programs. In the case that Professor Stewart was talking about of Seattle Safeco Corporation, Mike McGavick, the CEO there, is, in my opinion, one of the most passionate advocates of diversity in corporate America. He's a very creative and forward-thinking person on these issues. His theory is a very innovative one, as I see it, and has a lot of validity, because in the academy, academics have an important role to play in terms of developing theories and trying to explain who we are as a people, where we're going, and why we think the way we do. In corporate America, there are other things that a person can do, or leaders can do, in terms of trying to promote diversity while at the same time profiting from it. And I mean that in a good way, because when you blend the two, that's ideal, and people are more likely to respond to it when one appeals to pragmatism. I mean, I believe it was Ross Perot who said in the early 90s, when he was campaigning for president, he was very emphatic about this. He said something to the effect of, we should just love one another. And that's the first point, that we should all come together just because it's the right thing to do. At the same time, pragmatism is very important, and a lot of our CEOs are putting programs into place that show that doing the right thing can also be very good for business.
I want to follow up on when these changes come, the policy result changes are really at the heart of it. And some research indicates that as more women have gone into legislative positions in the state legislatures, state Senate, state House, it's really brought about some very positive results. For one thing, and I've always indicated that how incredibly special mothers are. They're just incredibly special. And anyone who has had a great relationship with their mother can understand what I'm saying. But one of the concerns that women have, which is so important, is protecting children. Mm-hmm. Licensing daycare centers are having background checks for those who run daycare centers, and nutrition programs. So I see in the increase of women in the legislature some really great positive programs insisting when you're inside and you're helping decision making, it makes a difference. So do you see that on several fronts across the country, whether it be in the academic world, the corporate world, or in government in general? And I guess I would also ask, in the academic world, where the changes come the fastest, is that correct?
In the academic world? Well, in different parts of our society, as Professor Stewart points out, that there's been more change in certain sectors than in other sectors. One of the points is the academy, from the beginning, of, say, the multicultural America in the early 70s or thereabouts has been a real proponent, for the most part, of trying to promote diversity in various contexts. These efforts have been largely successful in many parts of our country. You would be hard-pressed, in many cases, to find a considerable number of departments at many of our larger universities where one group predominates. Now, the research shows that some women professors are unhappy that their pay lags that of male counterparts. That's one issue. Some people have talked about the matter of promotions, whether they are as forthcoming as they should be for people who are not white and who are not male. Now, one of the issues that affects people in the academy and also beyond, affects women in particular, is the whole matter of whether women are penalized to some extent in the workforce, because many of them leave the paid labor force for a number of years to be full-time parents. And this is a very interesting issue, and one that is going to be the subject of much focus now and in the future, as well it should be, because when we look at the fact that we don't have all that many women CEOs, and I don't want to keep dwelling on CEOs, but it comes up there. When we look at why don't we have more women CEOs? Why don't we have more women who hold advanced positions in the academy? People are going back time and time again to the fact that many American women wish to leave the paid labor force for a number of years to focus on raising their children.
On that note, I'd bring the program to conclusion. Dominic Polera, but the good news for our viewers is that you'll come back to finish this story about your book next week. We knew we could not do justice to your book in 30 minutes, and so we will have you back. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been so pleased to have Dominic Polera, who is an author and a commentator and a consultant, a speaker and a writer, speaking today about his book, Sharing the Dream, White Males in Multicultural America. It is a publication from Continuum International Publishing, and it certainly is available in the bookstores. It came out in November of 2004. Please be with us when we continue this discussion next week on Sharing the Dream with Mr. Dominic Polera. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.